And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue to talk about the actual incident. So, on a previous podcast, we talked about the statutory incidence that was shown here by the shift in the supply curve. In this case, the statutory incidence was placed on the supplier. I know that because the supply curve shifted up by the amount of the tax. In this example that we've been talking about through a couple videos, our tax per unit was $6 per unit. And then we said that the consumer is going to pay part of the tax, part of their actual incidence is going to be paid by the consumer in the form of them paying a higher price. They used to pay $100 for the good, now they pay $103. And then the producers are going to pay part of the tax in the form of keeping less. They used to get paid $100 and they kept $100. Now they get paid $103, but they only keep $97. So we talked about all that on previous videos. But we now want to push farther with that idea, because now we want to say, what we want to do is identify specific areas on the graph. So the first area that we can define on the graph is the consumer actual incidence. All right, so what the consumer actual incidence is the amount of the tax paid by the consumer in the form of a higher price. And we did talk about that already, but we want to identify that full area on the graph, which is going to be right here. That's going to be the consumer actual incidence. Why is that going to be the consumer actual incidence? Well, the consumer used to pay P1 for the product, $100 we said, and now they're going to pay P2, which is $103. So they're going to pay $3 more per unit than they did before because of the tax. But they're going to buy Q2 units of the good. So to get the full consumer actual incidence, you have to take the amount of the tax that they pay, which is $3 of the $6 tax, multiplied by the number of units that they buy, which is whatever this number is, Q2, and then that height of 3 times the base of whatever Q2 is. Let's put a number on it. Let's say they're buying 10 units of the good. So that would mean that the consumer actual incidence would be equal to this area of this box, or this rectangle, which would be the height of 3 times the base of 10, so the consumer actual incidence would be $30. We can do the same sort of thinking logic with the producer actual incidence. So the producer actual incidence is paid by the producer in the form of keeping less. So in what way does the producer keep less? Well, the producer, we said, used to get paid $100 and they kept $100. Now they get paid $103, but they only get to keep $97 of it, because the other $6 they had the statutory legal obligation to mail that into the state. So they used to keep $100. Now they only keep $97. So that distance in between there, between P1 and P3, that distance is $3. The producer used to keep $100. Now they only keep $97. So they're going to pay $3 of the tax. And by the way, on the previous slide, we said the consumer was paying $3 of the tax as well, and there's your total $6. The consumer paid 3 of it, the producer paid 3 of it, and that's the total amount of the tax. I'll talk more about that in a second. So the producer's paying $3 of the tax in the form of keeping less, times the number of units that sell. We said let's pretend that's 10 for a second. So that's going to be the base of this. That's the quantity that sells. In this example, it's 10. And so this area right here is going to be the producer actual incidence, which is going to be 3 times 10, so it's going to be 30. That's going to be the producer actual incidence. That's the amount of the tax actually paid by the producer in the form of keeping less. And then we have the amount of the revenue collected by the government. And the amount of revenue collected by the government is equal to the amount that the consumer paid, that's the consumer actual incidence, plus the amount that the producer paid, that's the producer actual incidence. So you add those two together, take your consumer actual incidence, add to it the producer actual incidence, and then you have the total amount of money. Those two together gives you the total amount of revenue collected by the government. That's going to be, and I actually talked about this in the previous video, that's going to be the full $6 3 of it paid by the consumer, 3 of it paid by the producer in the form of keeping less. Add that together and you get the full $6 tax multiplied by the number of units that are purchased. We were pretending that that was 10. So that would give you, that box right there would give you the amount of revenue collected by the government. And that amount of revenue that collected by the government, part of it came from the consumer and part of it came from the producer. Okay, so both of them paid part of the actual incidence. All right, the next thing that we want to think about is the deadweight loss, because of the tax, there's going to be deadweight loss. That's what my DWL stands for. So the deadweight loss. All right, here's how we want to think about this. Before the tax, the consumers used to buy Q1 units of the good. They were buying Q1 units of whatever this product was, and now they're only going to buy Q2 units of the good. Okay, so maybe they used to buy 12 units and now they're only going to buy 10 units. So these extra units from Q2 to Q1, those extra 2 units of the product, people used to buy those and they used to enjoy them, and now they don't. Okay, Henry Hazlitt, the economist Henry Hazlitt would maybe have called this what is unseen. What is unseen? This is the unseen loss as a result of the tax. Because if the tax did not exist, 2 additional units of the product would have been produced and sold and enjoyed by the customer. So the happiness that the customer would have gotten from those extra 2 units, it just never happened. And that's a real loss to society. Okay, it's what is unseen. The happiness from these 2 products is unseen precisely because it never happens. Precisely because it never happens. And that lost happiness is what we call dead weight loss. That lost happiness is what we call dead weight loss. The dead weight loss is equal to the size of this triangle. Why? Well, if we think of from Q2 to Q1, we can think of the demand curve as the benefits that the customer would have gotten, the happiness they would have gotten from those 2 extra units from Q2 to Q1, and the supply curve is the cost of producing those 2 units from Q2 to Q1. And so the benefits of the product of those 2 units were higher than the costs of those 2 units, and so that area in between is where benefits outweigh the costs, but it never happens. That the happiness is greater than the cost of the product, but those additional 2 units never happens, and so all this happiness in here is lost. All that happiness is lost. Okay, it's consumer and producer surplus that would have happened, but now never do. Okay, so it's lost happiness as a result of the tax. That is the dead weight loss, which is equal to the size of this triangle. Okay, and we can calculate the area of that because we know the height is 6. Okay, and we know that, we know if you think about the triangle, if you kind of turn your head to the right sideways, you could think about this as the base of the triangle, which is 6, and here's the height of the triangle, which is 2. You could do base times height divided by 2 and actually get the area, the value of the area that represents the dead weight loss. All right, and then the last things that we want to think about, 2 more items here. We want to think about the consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus usually is going to be the area below the demand curve. If there was not a tax, it'd be the area below the demand curve and above the price. Okay, I talked about that on the previous on another video. It's the area below the demand curve and above the price. Would be the consumer surplus. However, part of the consumer surplus is lost because the consumer had to pay the tax. So that part of the consumer surplus goes to the government. And then part of the consumer surplus is just lost happiness because extra products that that are just not produced anymore. So the consumer surplus, the consumer loses this area of happiness to the government. They lose this area to just deadweight loss. It's happiness that would have happened and just never does. It's like almost like an econ black hole, if you will. There's just this happiness, and it's just boom, it's gone. It just never happens. And so the consumer surplus is now going to be just this smaller rectangle, or smaller triangle, up here at the top. So the consumer surplus is now going to be that smaller triangle. It's going to be the area below the demand curve, above what they actually pay, which is P2, up to the number of units they buy, which is Q2. And then finally, we have the producer actual incidence, the producer surplus. The producer surplus is going to be the area, first, what used to be the producer surplus. Let's say that first. Producer surplus used to be the area below the price and above the supply curve. It was this big triangle right there was the producer surplus, okay? But now the producer is going to lose some of their surplus because they used to get to keep $100, but they only get to keep 97 because they had to mail this part, this part they lost to the government. So that area is lost to the government, and then this area is lost because it just never happened. Okay, those units never get produced. So the producer loses this area. They lose this area. They're left with this little triangle down here at the bottom. That becomes their producer surplus. So the producer surplus now is going to be the area below what they keep, that's P3, and above the supply curve up to the number of units that are traded, So if I can just... I'm just going to clear all this so we can look at an uncluttered graph. So with all that writing cleared, we can look at this uncluttered graph, and now we can see what happens as a result of a tax. There's the statutory incidence. That's on the producer in this case because the supply curve shifted up by the amount of the tax. And then there's the actual incidence, which is always going to be the area between P1 and P2 over to Q2, over to the number of units to trade. That will always be the consumer actual incidence. The producer actual incidence will always be from P1 down to P3, over to the number of units to trade. That will always be the producer actual incidence. The revenue collected by the government, the amount of tax that goes to the government, is the consumer plus producer actual incidence together. That's always going to be this larger area. There's always going to be the deadweight loss, which is the triangle here at the end. And then the new consumer surplus and the new producer surplus are going to be these triangles at the top and the bottom. Okay, so that's what it looks like on the graph when a government institutes a sales tax. All right, that's a lot of stuff there. Hope it helps. This has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.